In response to my recent video lecture on envy, one person responded by pointing to the work of Karen Horney. I've always wondered what is the proper pronunciation of her name, given Freud's emphasis on sex in psychoanalysis. I've always been a bit uncomfortable referring to her as Karen Horney, so I have tended to refer to as Karen Horney, but I'm not sure whether that's correct or not. In any case, he pointed to her work, particularly one of her books called Neurosis and Human Growth, and I had read the book many, many years ago, so I went and had another brief look at it, or rather in my case, because my vision is pretty much shot, I had to listen to it, and the value of her ideas came back to me quickly. She's one of the relatively few psychoanalytic thinkers who posits the idea of an intrinsic drive in the individual towards self-realization. Of course, Abraham Maslow, outside the psychoanalytic tradition, referred to a self-actualization tendency. Heinz Kohut posited kind of an inborn program in the infant that it seeks to develop or realize, and in order to do so needs adequate, what Kohut called self-object function from the interpersonal surround. So these ideas are there to some extent, but Horney makes the drive towards self-realization pretty central in her thinking, which means she does not see the infant as a tabula rasa, an empty slate upon which society inscribes its text, or a kind of vacuum into which society pours all of the contents. No, she sees an infant with certain innate potentialities for development and an innate wish or tendency toward the development of these potentials, but that this drive for self-actualization needs to be supported, encouraged, not blocked, not discouraged by the social surround. So she's pointing to the interaction between the healthy infant with its drive to develop itself positively and an environment, others, significant others, who will either promote this development, encourage it, or interfere with it, thwart it, leading, in that case, to neurosis. Neurosis being a state in which a person is more or less turned against themselves. There's much more to be said about Karen Horney, the three tendencies she identifies in people as reactions to the kind of basic anxiety that she posits, a basic anxiety that comes from negative experiences with the caretakers. In one case, a person defensively develops a tendency to comply, to seek the approval and to comply with the expectations of others, moving towards others, or one can move against others and become a rebel, perhaps an outlaw, aggressively pushing back against the social pressures, or one could move away from others, withdrawal into a kind of schizoid isolation or self-sufficiency, kind of omnipotent self-sufficiency, a retreat from others in the face of the frustration that generates this basic anxiety. Okay, in all of this, Horney is saying something rather different from the other two figures who are generally thought of as her colleagues in what has come to be called the neo-Freudian or the culturistic or interpersonal school of psychoanalysis. Looking first at Harry Stack Sullivan. Sullivan is much more of a sociological thinker in certain ways than Karen Horney is. She certainly emphasizes the interaction between society and the inborn potentials of the child, but she certainly doesn't see society as totally creating the child. Sullivan is much more of a social determinist, seeing us as pretty much shaped by others, by significant others. The self is, for Sullivan, a self created by and essentially imposed on us by the significant others. Even more so than the philosopher George Herbert Mead, who influenced Sullivan. Sullivan at least saw an I, a subjective I, in tension with the socially derived me, the me or self-image that I see in the looking glass held up to me by society. Charles Horton Cooley's looking glass self, Cooley, an early sociologist who described the looking glass self, the self that we see in the mirror held up to us by society. This is George Herbert Mead's me, but it is not his I. The self for Mead is a dialogue between a subjective I and a socially derived me. So Mead was aware of something in the self, unpredictable, not entirely shaped by society. And therefore, to use the terminology of my old friend and mentor, the sociologist Dennis H. Wrong, who in 1961 wrote the classic article, The Over-Socialized Concept of Man in Modern Sociology, Mead is not guilty of what Wrong called the over-socialized conception of man. He would have been guilty of that if he only saw the me and did not posit a subjective I. Similarly, I argued in a dissertation I wrote in 1977, I believe, I argued that the sociological school of Peter Berger and Thomas Luckmann, the social construction of reality, it's a school of thought that came to be known as reality constructionism, they too are not guilty of the over-socialized concept of man, because they drew on Sartrean existentialism and saw in human beings a capacity to say no to society, to rebel against society, to manipulate society, to achieve an inner attitude of role distance, an inner detachment from social pressures because of the degree of freedom that human beings enjoy and suffer. To follow in the Sartrean vein, we are condemned to be free because it is a great burden. Certainly Erich Fromm saw freedom in this way as well. The title of his great book, Escape from Freedom into Totalitarianism, because this burden of freedom is hard to bear. Okay, Dennis Wrong himself was critical of the sociological understanding of human nature. We could call this sociologism. And this is pretty much the over-socialized view, as Wrong saw it, that human beings are entirely social products, that we really bring hardly anything to the table, that whatever shape we wind up having is the shaping that society, through our significant others, the socialization that we receive. We are products of socialization. To use the language of Irving Goffman, a person is the sum of the social roles that he or she plays. I have called this the situational theory of the self. The self is not a fixed entity. There is no real self or fixed self or true self. The self is merely a product of the changing roles, and therefore personality change is very easy, and it's going on all the time. When the teacher comes home from school, from the classroom, where she is her teacher self, now she's home, and her wife self comes to the fore, or her kids are there, the mother self is there. Ourselves are changing as we change the roles we play. The self is the sum of the social roles we play. This is quite in contrast to the substantive theory of the self, in which the self is something that is a part of us that we carry with us into the many different situations, into the many different roles we play, but that there is a core to the self. Karen Horney certainly does not have an entirely over-socialized concept of the person, because she sees a certain inborn set of potentials that the person carries with them and is trying to realize, trying to actualize, something that is there in the self that pushes back against the socialization pressures. And who we become depends on this interaction between these forces. So Horney is not guilty of an entirely over-socialized concept of man. I think Harry Stack Sullivan is guilty of what Wrong would have called an over-socialized concept of man. In their textbook, Object Relations in Psychoanalytic Theory, Greenberg and Mitchell, in their chapter on interpersonal psychoanalysis, try to defend Sullivan against this charge, and I think they do a poor defense. And it's odd, really, that they try to defend him against the charge of reducing individuality to society. But there's an epigram at the beginning of the chapter, and it refers to Nietzsche and the birth of tragedy, and it refers to the principium individua, sorry, I can't remember the Latin, but meaning the principle of individuality, is cast into doubt in this epigram. So here they are trying to defend Sullivan against reducing the individual to just a product of society, and they do acknowledge in the chapter that Sullivan wrote a controversial paper entitled The Illusion of Personal Individuality. Their epigram to the chapter also suggests that individuality is illusory. We think we're individuals, we think we're unique, but really we are products of society. We are products of the mirroring in mother's eyes, father's eyes, peers, school, and so on. Our individuality is an illusion, suggests Sullivan. They try to defend him against this reduction of the individual to the social, but they choose as their epigram this quotation which suggests that individuality is an illusion. Well, of course, the sociologists love this kind of thing. The sociology as a discipline has tended very much to seek to reduce the individual to the social. Emil Durkheim, the founding father of the discipline of sociology, had no patience for psychology. He more or less defined sociology as anti-psychology and anti-biology. He was against biological reductionism and sociological and psychological reductionism, against biological and psychological reduction. And that sets the field up to purvey sociological reductionism, sociologism, as against both psychologism and biologism. So I would invite you to imagine a triangle, and at the two poles at the base of the triangle we have nature and biologism, biological reductionism, biological determinism, and at the other pole is nurture, sociological reductionism, sociological determinism. That would be the over-socialized concept of man. At the other end, the under-socialized concept of man. And we can place different psychoanalytic theories at different points in the continuum between these two extremes. Okay, it would be because of his drive theory, which Freud grounded ultimately in biology, in the body, in instincts and their vicissitudes. He said that the drive, and of course it was mistranslated using the English word instinct by Strachey, and people blame Strachey for representing Freud as a biological reductionism, whereas if you read Freud in the German, you see that he did not use the German word for animal instinct. He used the word Trieb, which should have been translated as drive. But even when we overcome this translation issue, Freud makes very clear in his essay, Drives and Their Vicissitudes, as it should have been called, not Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, that the drive is composed of four elements: an aim, an object, a pressure, and a source. Yes, Freud knew that the human drives differ from animal instincts in that they are not, their aims and objects are not pre-programmed, they're not hardwired, they're not built in. The human drive is much more open to learning and defensive alteration. For example, the aim to see can be switched to the aim to be seen. The wish to penetrate can be reversed into the wish to be penetrated. And of course, the objects can be shifted around or displaced. My Oedipal desire for mother can be shifted onto my idealized kindergarten teacher whom I have a crush on. Okay, human drives are not animal instincts, but nevertheless, Freud insists that the human drives bubble up from a somatic source. He did not mean the brain. He thought sexuality bubbled up from the gonads, from the genital region of the body. He also thought that the aggressive drive emerged from a somatic source, but he admitted he couldn't specify what that somatic source was, which should have caused him to question the whole idea of the drives as rooted in a somatic source. It did not cause him to question that. It should have. So Freud is still guilty, translation issues aside, he's still guilty of reducing human motivation, human sexuality, and human aggression ultimately to the biological. And of course there's a tremendous amount of evidence that this is in error. Human sexuality has much more to do with the symboling mind, with fantasy, with stories, with scenarios, rather than anything biological. It employs the body, it causes the body to become aroused and to experience things like orgasm, but the whole thing starts for human beings in the mind, trickles down to the body, doesn't bubble up from the body to the mind. Freud really got that backwards. So in that sense, Freud is a biological biological reductionist when it comes to the drives. But he's not totally a biological reductionist. If he only saw the id, the baby for Freud is born all id with the drives of sex and aggression, and these bubble up from the body. If that's all he saw was the id drives, he would have been a complete extreme biological reductionist. But of course, he also saw ego, which was reason, rationality, thinking, and he also saw superego, which he acknowledged comes in from society via the parental superegos. Societal norms are internalized. That's not all a superego is. It's also id hatred turned back against the ego. But still, Freud is thinking sociologically when he thinks of the degree to which the superego is internalized from society. So his overall concept of the human being, id, ego, and superego, is irreducible to the id and is irreducible to the drives. So in that sense, Freud is not an extreme biological reductionist, despite his reductionist theory of the drives as originating from somatic sources. Okay, the extreme biological reductionist has an under-socialized concept of man, and I think to a degree Freud does have an somewhat under-socialized concept of man. He sees the social coming in through the superego, but he sees the drives as biologically rooted, whereas the reality is that many of our human motivations have nothing whatever to do with biology. They certainly don't originate in the biological. Many of our motives are grounded in, for example, anxiety. We seek to escape anxiety. So motivation cannot be reduced to drive in the sense that, now I'm not negating the reality of sexual drives or aggressive drives, motives that are sexual, that are aggressive. I'm simply talking about how these cannot be reduced to the somatic source that Freud posited. Okay, Sullivan, over-socialized concept of man, the illusion of unique individuality. Freud, more of a mixed view, but certainly under-socialized elements in his thinking. Karen Horney is somewhere in the middle there. Like the other neo-Freudians, she rejects Freudian drive theory, but she still posits something inborn. She refers to the acorn and the oak tree, and the acorn has the potential to develop into an oak tree. The baby comes into the world with this potentiality. What happens to that will depend on the interaction with others. But the baby is not a tabula rasa, is not an empty vessel for Karen Horney. Okay, so we have Freud, we have Horney, we have Sullivan. Traditionally, Erich Fromm is also seen as a member of this culturistic school, and as a psychoanalyst who tried to integrate Marx with Freud, a Freudo-Marxist, and he is that, and so we might suspect that, like Sullivan, he has succumbed to an over-socialized concept of man. But this would be incorrect, because unlike Sullivan, and also unlike Horney, Fromm is an existentialist. Very different in many ways from Jean-Paul Sartre, but also quite close to Sartre in this central respect that for Fromm, the human being is what he calls the freak of nature. He's the animal who has partially fallen out of nature. He remains tied to nature by his body. We are animals, but we are the animal who awakened. I don't know whether Fromm refers to Kierkegaard's discussion of Genesis as myth rather than history, but certainly for Kierkegaard, Genesis is a mythical account of how at some point the pre-human being awakened and became Homo sapiens, and this is repeated in the development of every child. At some point in the second year of life, the child wakes up. The child has been an animal, very unlike any other animal, because the human animal has the potential to wake up. Other animals do not. There have been experiments with chimps. The newborn chimp and the newborn child raised identically, and at a certain point the chip hits the wall and the kid just takes off. And that happens with the chimp has to go back to the zoo. The child acquires language, symbolic functioning. And with this eruption of language and symbolic functioning, they knew they were naked and fashioned fig leaves to cover themselves. They ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and they became self-aware, they became self-conscious, and they became ashamed, and they covered their nakedness. And they were expelled from Eden, and a flaming sword was placed at the east to prevent their return. This is the fall of man. This is the emergence into symbolic consciousness. And this is both a wonderful and a terrible thing. Wonderful in that it results in art, music, philosophy. Terrible in the sense that we become the creature that destroys its own ecosystems. We now have anthropogenic climate disruption in the Anthropocene, facing the sixth extinction brought about by us. This is because we are the biologically incompletely regulated animal. We are able to commit suicide, and unknowingly we are committing suicide in that we are increasingly destroying the ecosystems we depend on. Okay, so we're an animal unlike any other animal, a uniquely destructive animal, a uniquely creative animal. Later in his life, Fromm echoes Freud's Eros-Thanatos duality. He refers to necrophilia and biophilia. Biophilia, the love of life. Necrophilia, the hatred of life. We're pulled in these two directions. An animal torn by conflict because of symbolic functioning. Okay, Fromm, like Horney, sees anxiety as a central aspect of the human condition, but he understands the anxiety differently than Karen Horney did. She sees the anxiety as coming from caretakers who are out of sync with the child's innate potentials and needs, and instead of helping the child facilitate the process of becoming who he is, actualizing himself, these caretakers are blocking this development, thwarting it in various ways, and the result of this is anxiety. And out of this anxiety comes the resort to one of these three defensive patterns that she identifies: moving towards, moving against, moving away from others. So this is an anxiety that is a reaction to misattunement. Fromm would also recognize that, for sure. But like Sartre and like Kierkegaard, he sees an existential anxiety in the human being that is nobody's fault. That is, it is not produced by misattunement. It's produced by emergence into humanness. This is existential anxiety, the anxiety of the animal who has awakened and knows that he's going to die, knows that he will die, can die, death anxiety, and burdened with freedom, which means he has decisions to make, and he doesn't have the data needed to make the decisions, but he has to make them anyway. So this is the human condition. This is the existential anxiety that is nobody's fault. It's not society's fault. As a Marxist, of course, Fromm will say society can make it worse, that a socialist society would ease it to some extent, not eliminate it. A capitalist society inflames it in various ways. But this is existential. He's an existential Marxist, as is Jean-Paul Sartre. Okay, so Fromm really should not be considered a part of the culturistic school at all. He does have a much more social understanding of the human condition than Freud and the Freudians, and I think also the Kleinians. So he does move towards a more relational social psychoanalysis. He does bring Marxism into the picture, which means bringing history and class into the picture. But he certainly does not reduce the individual to social and historical programming. He does not see the individual as a mere product of historical and social conditions. He acknowledges the conditioning, but it is an individual with a capacity for freedom and burdened with freedom, who has to choose his life under conditions not of his own making. That would be both Sartre and Fromm. As Marxists, they recognize, of course, we do not choose the conditions under which we have to operate, that we're born into, that we're thrown into, to use Heidegger's term. But nevertheless, we have a degree of freedom and responsibility for the choices that we make under these conditions, not of our own choosing. Like Horney, he sees anxiety as central, but he doesn't reduce anxiety to being a product of social thwarting. He sees existential anxiety that is nobody's fault, that is just part of the human condition. This makes him a far more sophisticated thinker than either Sullivan or Fromm, and I would say in some ways a more sophisticated thinker than Freud, who dismissed the idea of free will as a mere illusion. I mean, Sullivan saw personal individuality as an illusion. Freud saw free will as an illusion. Not so Sartre, not so Erich Fromm, not so Kierkegaard, and, just to remind ourselves, not so for the Abrahamic religions. We forget that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are existentialist theories. They attribute freedom and responsibility, and therefore guilt, to human beings. So existentialism is not this esoteric doctrine dreamed up in Germany by Heidegger, in Denmark by Kierkegaard, in Paris by Sartre, existentialism at its core argues that human beings are free to a degree, significant degree, and responsible. And that's Judaism and Christianity and Islam. Okay, so the under-socialized, overly biologized concept of human nature, the over-socialized concept of human nature, and then an existential concept in which the human being has to cope with biology because we are animals. We have to cope with society because we're social animals, but we have a degree of freedom and have to navigate our way through these conditions and have a degree of responsibility. Towards the very end of his life, Sartre was asked, in light of his Marxism, how free did he consider human beings to be, and he answered that he continued to insist that human beings have that small degree of freedom to make something out of what has been made of them, if only to choose their attitude towards it. Freedom to make something out of what has been made of me by history, by parents, by my biological potentials and talents or lack thereof, what society has done to me. I still have a degree of freedom to make something out of what has been made of me, if only to choose my attitude towards what has been made of me. I could decide to be disgusted with what has been made of me. I could potentially be so disgusted with what has been made of me that I choose to kill myself. I mean, someone who social conditions and biological conditions has turned into a psychopath might actually see this, see what he has become, be disgusted by it, and want to put an end to it. That would be an act of freedom. I'm not recommending this, but I'm simply saying that at the very least, we sometimes have the freedom to choose our attitude toward what we have become. Sometimes we have the freedom to do more than that. We have the freedom to change what society and so on has made of us. We have some degree to say no to the self that we have been made into. I would say also that we have chosen, and we can have the freedom to choose differently. And of course, psychoanalysis as a therapy is trying to maximize this by helping us see more clearly what we have become, and to help us not only choose our attitude towards this, but also to exercise our freedom to change. Okay.